Even the left today, Jenny Beth, say that Clarence Thomas is the most influential thinker and significant appointment in 40 years. It's his personal courage as a justice, right? That is showing the other justices how to do this.
Keeping our republic is on the line, and it requires patriots with great passion, dedication, and eternal vigilance to preserve our freedoms. Jenny Beth Martin is the co-founder of Tea Party Patriots. She is an author, a filmmaker, and one of Time Magazine's most influential people in the world. But the title she is most proud of is mom to her boy-girl twins. She has been at the forefront, fighting to protect America's core principles for more than a decade. Welcome to the Jenny Beth Show.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas is a national treasure. He is fiercely independent, courageous, and a staunch defender of the United States Constitution. Ever since his confirmation process for the United States Supreme Court, the left has engaged in a never-ending campaign to destroy him. Our next guest, Mark Paoletta, is one of Clarence Thomas's greatest defenders. Mark is an attorney, an author, a filmmaker, and a personal friend of Justice Thomas. In this episode, you will hear one of the greatest American stories about a Black man born into extreme poverty in the Deep South and his rise all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Mark Paoletta, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you so much for being such a staunch defender of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. I just love how much you love him and want to defend him, and I'm looking forward to our discussion today. Thanks for having me on. I do love him, and I do love defending him. It's wonderful. So you first met him when you were in college. Yeah, it was a great one of these serendipitous stories of going up for a fundraiser for my uncle, who was the mayor of Bridgeport, Connecticut. And my mentor had, and I flew up on Air Force Two with the vice president. When the event was over, I went over to another event, and Clarence Thomas was there with my mentor, who had set up the trip, which was Tom Malady. And we spent about an hour at the Hilton in the lobby talking together and with a couple other people. And it was just electrifying. He was just such an engaging person. I was a college senior. And again, you'll hear this a lot from anyone who knows Clarence Thomas. He pays attention to you. So here I am. He's the chairman of the EEOC at the time. This was 1983, October of 1983, and I just had a wonderful time talking with him. And I remembered it when flash forward, I'm in the Bush 41 White House in presidential personnel, and we were looking for candidates to pick for the judicial for the judgeships. I was on the Judicial Selection Committee. And somebody raised that we wanted to speak with Clarence Thomas, and I volunteered to reach out to him. So in February of 1989, I reached out to Clarence Thomas to ask for all of his speeches and articles. This is before the internet, of course. And he sent me over a large pack of speeches and articles, and I read them, and they were electrifying. And that began our relationship. Which has turned into a lifelong friendship, it seems like to me. So you got to know him, and you helped him with that process in the White House for his first appointment as a judge, right? This is not for the Supreme Court at that point? Right, and he ended up getting appointed in 1990. He was selected in 1989, but I helped him on the D.C. Circuit confirmation, and we became friends. Ginny and my wife Tricia, and gotten to be friends with him, and then lo and behold, in July of 1991. President Bush selects Justice Clarence Thomas, to be a justice replacing Thurgood Marshall. And that experience that he went through with his confirmation was really unlike anything we had seen up until that point for the Supreme Court. Is that correct? That's right. Jenny Beth, when I read those speeches back in 89, you saw Clarence Thomas sort of standing up for what he believed in and never backing down, and driving the civil rights establishment crazy, driving the left crazy, and also standing his ground against other people within the Reagan administration. He was just a fiercely independent thinker. And I said, calling people out, and I wondered whether he could get confirmed, originally to the DC circuit in a Democrat-controlled Congress. I think they had 57 Democrats at the time, and it was just I knew it would be tough. Right, and you saw him getting attacked during the 80s too, when he was in the Reagan administration. And so right from the get-go, he's nominated on July 1st, and right from the get-go, he's attacked, on everything. It was just incoming every day. We never thought, right, and through all of this, that it would be these lies that came upon at the end with Anita Hill and these allegations. But it clearly showed that the left wanted to stop Clarence Thomas at all costs.
And I was in college when that confirmation was going on, and I remember watching the vote and being so excited that he was confirmed, and just saw what happened to him was unreal. But I was probably 20 or 21 years old in 1991, and I don't think I had a lot to compare it to because I hadn't watched a lot of Supreme Court confirmations up until that point. But it just, what was going on with him seemed so horrible. I want to go back in his life a little bit, and then we'll go from that point, from his confirmation forward, and talk about the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
But in that moment in time, I think the kind of man that he was when he was defending himself is shaped so much by what happened to him in his childhood and his early years.
Yeah.
Can you talk and tell people a little bit about his life?
It's the most amazing, what I'll call American story, right? And that's why everyone should know it. He was born in 1948 in Pinpoint, Georgia, during segregation, in abject poverty, right, to parents who were uneducated, right? His father left the family when he was 2 years old. His mom had 3 kids. And Pinpoint is sort of 10 miles outside of Savannah, and it's kind of on the marsh, right near Moon River, actually, of the Johnny Mercer song. And it was rural poverty, as Clarence Thomas says, right? So, but it was in segregation and places you couldn't go and things you couldn't do, right? And it was terrible. The house he's living in, this little shanty, and again, no one light bulb in the shanty, no indoor plumbing, right? Holes in the walls that they filled in with newspapers and the like. Just very, very poor, right? But as he said, relatively happy in his little community because it was a community, right? The shanty that he's living in burns down when he's 6 years old, and he has to go to live in Savannah with his mom. His mom's a maid. She's been picking crabs in the crab factory and working as a maid for white families in Savannah. And he goes into Savannah to live with her in a one-room tenement where he sleeps on a chair. His brother, his sister stays behind in Pinpoint, and his younger brother Myers goes with Clarence to live with his mom in Savannah. And it's a hellhole, as Clarence says, and he doesn't know where he's going to eat. His mom really can't take care of him. She's working for these families. He's wandering around the streets as a 6-year-old, not going to school. This is the life that Clarence Thomas was living, you know what I mean? And through the grace of God, as he says, right, his mom, who's having trouble raising her 2 sons, goes to her grandfather and grandmother who live in Savannah and say, "Can you help me?" And so he goes to live when he's 7 to go live with his grandparents in Savannah, a couple blocks from where his mom was, and that changes his life utterly. And as I've described this kind of tough, non-easy childhood, his grandfather, the first thing his grandfather says when he sits down is, "Boys, the damn vacation is over." And Clarence looks at his younger brother like, what vacation is he talking about?
And he was 7 at
7 years old,
and his brother was 6, right?
Right. And his grandfather says, from now on, it's going to be rules and regulations, manners and behavior. And Myers Anderson, his grandfather, again, born in 1907 in the Deep South, okay, who knows hardship, who knows discrimination, had found a way to make it as a small businessman. With he first had a coal delivery business and an ice delivery business. By the time Clarence and his brothers came to live with him, it was a fuel oil business. And so, as Justice Thomas said, that was his greatest learning place, to be on the truck with his grandfather every single day, delivering fuel oil. And then during the summer, his grandfather actually built a farm out in Liberty County, about 20 miles away, where he spent his summers, because his grandfather didn't want him hanging around with friends that might get him in trouble. So it was a very disciplined, very, work-oriented childhood that Justice Thomas grew up in. The other significant thing, in addition to going to live with his grandparents in 1955, was his grandfather, who was a converted Catholic, enrolled him in the Catholic school there called St. Benedict's, which was, again, under segregation, the all-black school. And it was run by these Irish nuns and led by Sister Mary Virgilius, who became a very influential figure in Justice Thomas's life. But he goes to the Catholic school with his brother, and that transforms it too, because those nuns, who are called horrible things for living in the South and teaching black children, right, are determined to make sure those kids believe in themselves and know that they were equal despite these horrible laws, and teach Clarence Thomas, we're going to hold you to the highest standards, no excuses. You're going to learn everything to send you out into this world, this tough world, but we love you, and we are going to help shape you. And so between the grandparents and the nuns, that is how Justice Thomas's kind of foundation is made for him to go off into this world and be the person who thinks for himself and never backs down.
When I've read part of the book, and I'm making my way through the book right now, one of the things that I think is so insightful about him is that he says that his grandfather and grandmother were very, very disciplined with him. And later, as more of an adult, he's interacting with them and other family members who are helping take care of him and were very disciplined and strict during this time. And they were laid back and casual and just treating him more as an equal, because he was an adult then. And he realized how hard and difficult it must have been for them to keep their game face on with him to be disciplined so that they could teach him. And I think that's such a... They were getting him up at 4 o'clock in the morning and making him work and sending him to school. And on the weekends, there was no play, there were no sports, it was work or going to the library. They let him go to the library all he wanted. And but it takes a lot to realize that wasn't easy to do, that sometimes as a parent, you have to do things that are very hard, even when you know it isn't what your child wants, but you know it's what they need.
That's why this book is so beautiful, because Justice Thomas talks about that. Both of his books, the Created Equal book and his memoirs, which are My Grandfather's Son. That recognition, that looking back on his grandparents and the nuns and how they needed to keep their game face on, right, to help raise them and teach them what they needed to teach them, And he goes back, right? He goes back and sees his grandfather, obviously, when he's older. But the nuns, now here's Justice Thomas in the 1980s, who, and we can talk about his journey up into that point. But he's always searching and always questioning, sort of, and trying to be a better person. And he seeks out the nuns, and particularly Sister Virgilius, who's retired up in Massachusetts by this point, and goes to visit with her. And again, she was this nice, sort of aunt, if you will, a kind. And he's like, wow, she was so firm and stern with me when I was a child. And that's a great point in terms of his reflections on it. But just thinking about that, and right, parents need to, or teachers need to teach. They're not there to be your best friend. They're there to be your parent or your teacher and teach you right and wrong.
And he also recognizes that while he was living in what is rural poverty, and in poverty that most of us in today's America can't even quite imagine, that it was still safe. Even in the segregated South,
yes.
He was not running into a lot of what he ran into later as he was a bit older, and he could walk down the streets and he could walk to school even as a very young child without people weren't worried that that harm was going to come to the children, because the community looked out for one another.
That's exactly what it was, Mary Beth. The community, right? And he talks about the responsibilities of the community and how everyone looked out for one another and your neighbors, and if you were causing trouble, and how that's broken down today. And so it is an interesting point of some of the pathologies or breakdown in the family, and he kind of runs it back to the government and how the government has intervened and destroyed the family fabric or the community fabric in a way that says the government will take care of this. And as he says later in the book, does the government know who you are? You know what I mean? People, in my community, there's so many, when you talk to Clarence Thomas and in these books, he always goes back to his grandfather so much, right? There's always these lessons that, it's just, he calls him the greatest man he ever, he had 9 months of education, Myers-Anderson, right? 3 months every year up to the 3rd grade, but 9 months total. And he calls him the wisest man he ever knew. And his grandfather said something like, we knew who wanted to work and couldn't work, right? Or didn't want to work and couldn't work, right? In terms of helping out people. And that's what government programs miss a lot, right? And so his reflections both on growing up and then looking back at the communities now and how they've changed so much is a really interesting part of the book.
It is. One thing I think that what the films that you've helped with and the books help, and part of what I appreciate so much about what you're doing is that Clarence Thomas, just this name, he has been so villainized by the left that they're trying to dehumanize him and make it seem like he's just this horrible, horrible villain with no soul and no empathy and whatever other bad things they can put on him. But you help humanize him and show who he truly is, and open these doors to let people see this man that they otherwise may never even understand who he is. As I was reading about his early childhood, I'm from Georgia. Originally, I've moved to Florida in the last year, but my whole life I lived in Georgia. So several months ago, I was like, where is Pinpoint, Georgia? Which county is it in? Because in Georgia, we do this weird thing where we pay attention to the counties. I'm like, it's Chatham County.
Yes.
And I have family who is from a really small town in the southeastern corner of Georgia, and I used to go see them as a small child, and my father and my uncles went to spend time with my aunt over the summers growing up in Ellabelle, Georgia, which is maybe 30 miles away from Savannah. So as I was reading some of that, I'm thinking, my dad is down in that same area, maybe a little, not exactly at the exact same time, but in very close to those times, seeing a lot of that rural country area, and my parents and my family was not a very wealthy family. So, they experienced, it just was interesting to know I've been down there and heard some of my dad's stories, and then I'm hearing the stories and thinking about what it was like for Clarence Thomas as well. And it was humanizing him, which is very important to do.
So there's a museum down there, the Pinpoint Museum, which is literally like the crab factory. It was the old crab factory, which had fallen into disrepair, and so that's been renovated. There's the oyster factory, the crab factory, and it's a great museum. It focuses on the community, which is the Gullah Geechee community. Free Blacks that was founded down in the 1870s, and it was a very small, not a town, just a little community right on the marsh. It's really interesting. You feel so far away from everything when you're there, and then about 10 miles, I guess, is where Savannah is, where he then moved. Clarence moved when he was 7 or 6 to go live with his mom. So they're worlds away, you know what I mean, just in terms of feel. But I encourage people to go down to the Pinpoint Museum. It's a beautiful, it's a great museum. And Justice Thomas is in it just as a member of the community, not like you hear his voice and there's this video and he's talking about growing up there and the bateaus, the boats that went out to catch the fish and the like, and the whole community that was really centered on the water and getting the fish and living there. So it's a neat place. And then, like I said, where he grew up in Savannah. As he says, most people think of Savannah like the book or the novel, the movie, the Midnight of Good and Evil, right?
Right, in the Garden of Good and Evil.
There you go. And as Clarence Thomas says in his own memoirs, I didn't grow up in that area.
Yeah.
So it's a great. Like I said, I encourage your audience to read his memoirs, which are called My Grandfather's Son, which came out I think in 2008, which goes up to when he goes through his whole, his childhood and his journey to the Supreme Court, but ends on the day he gets sworn in at the Supreme Court.
So he moves in with his grandfather, and he goes through his childhood and adolescence, and then he goes on to seminary. And briefly touch on that before we go back to the 90s when he's sworn in.
So he goes. He does very well at St. Benedict's. He's a top student. He's an altar boy. And he thinks he has a calling to be a priest. So he asks his grandfather, "Can I go to this? It's called a minor seminary. It's like a high school for young men who think they want to be a priest." So he goes off to St. John Vianney. Now it turns out that was all segregated, and Clarence Thomas and another young man were the first 2 black students to go there, right? And then that the other student, drops out his next year. So Clarence Thomas is the only black student in this seminary. And he says there, like, I walk in, everyone else is white. I got that. We're different. What do we have in common? And so you see this theme through his life of looking for commonality, right? And what brings us together. And so there are racial incidents there, and there are things that he has to put up with. And he talks about that and how he dealt with it, and how he wanted to get the highest grades possible, right? I think the thing at the end in his senior year in the yearbook says, blew that test, only got a 99. And Clarence Thomas was like, I was determined, right, that I was going to be the best there was, so that no one could have an excuse for discriminating against me other than to expose you for your racism, okay? And he goes off to a college seminary in Missouri with, they had become close by the end, the students there, and all 7 of them, I think it is, they all go off to this one college together. And he loses his vocation again. He doesn't lose his faith. He loses his faith in the church, and some racial episodes that happen there that are just terrible. And he decides, I'm not going. I want to leave the priesthood. Now, when he had asked his grandfather to allow him to go and pay for it was expensive to go to the school, his grandfather said, "Okay, if you go, you can't quit." And so when Clarence Thomas decides to leave and quit the seminary, he comes back home, and his grandfather says, basically, "You just quit and you're out of my house." So he kicks him out of the house. And he has to go live back with his mother. This would have been his freshman year in college. And he decides that, again, one of the nuns that had been one of his teachers sent him an application, heard he was having problems there, sent him an application to Holy Cross College up in Massachusetts. And so Clarence Thomas applies there and ends up going to Holy Cross. And this is in the summer of '68, when Martin Luther King is assassinated, when Bobby Kennedy is assassinated. And Clarence Thomas essentially says, I shoved aside my Catholicism, and race and racism explained everything. And he really sort of embraced Black nationalism and said, I was a man without a country, and became, as he said, a very angry man. And he goes up to Holy Cross and joins all these protests, and ultimately participates in a riot in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which really shakes him to his core. And when you see him in this period, it's so classic Clarence Thomas. Like he's clearly kind of left wing, but he's always challenging even his friends on that side, in terms of what he wants to do, and working through those issues. But he ultimately sort of kind of realizes, I think, the destructiveness of that approach. And he stops in front of the church. He had left the church after this riot and comes back, and he looks up. He's standing outside the chapel at Holy Cross, and he says to God, if you take anger out of my heart, I'll never hate again. And as he says, it's a slow return to his grandfather's and the nuns' principles at Holy Cross. So that's his kind of his journey. He goes to Yale Law School after that. And it's the first time where the kind of the liberal paternalism of the left, he sees it in all its sort of ugliness, and he says that people assume he's there because of his race, and he really resents it, but by the end of law school, and he does very, very well there, he can't find a job, and he interviews with all these law firms, and doesn't get an offer. He's a Yale law grad. He's done very well there. He got the highest grade on his paper, and he finally gets a job with Jack Danforth, who's the Attorney General, a Republican Attorney General out in Missouri, newly elected. And as Clarence says in the book and the movie, the only thing wrong with Jack Danforth is he was a Republican, which was detestable to me. But it was the only job he had. Went out there and fell in love with working for Jack Danforth as an assistant attorney general in the attorney general's office out in Missouri. Spends several years out there, and ultimately comes with Jack Danforth to Washington, D.C. when Jack Danforth was just a senator in the late 70s.
And then when from there he's in the Senate. So when does he go from the Senate to the administration? So
one thing that happens when he's out in Missouri, and he's ultimately goes to work for this company Monsanto in St. Louis, and he comes across Thomas Sowell's book and Race and Economics, and that revolutionizes his kind of life and thinking. He falls in love with Thomas Sowell. He goes to see him speak, and I say that because he comes to Washington, and he's clearly a sort of a Thomas Sowell acolyte, and meets Thomas Sowell and hosts him for events in Washington. And Thomas Sowell, because of that, invites him to this convention or this conference called the Fairmont Conference, which was a number of Black conservatives that were getting together at the very beginning of the Reagan administration, just before it started in December of 1980. And it's at that conference where Clarence Thomas talks to a Washington Post reporter and talks about his concerns about some of the social policies on the left and their destructiveness to the Black family. And that Washington Post story that kind of catapults Clarence Thomas into kind of a public figure, and the Reagan administration sort of is interested in him coming into the administration, and he becomes at first the assistant secretary for the Department of Education in 1981, and then ultimately goes over to the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, as a chairman in 1983. Does a great job there. You have these critics and people trashing Justice Thomas. It's just false. Even the Washington Post, by the time of near the end of his term there, said he did a great job. at the EEOC. It had been a complete disaster under Eleanor Holmes Norton. And Justice Thomas, in running that agency, didn't think you should just, if anyone makes a complaint, you just basically have some letter, somebody pays money, nobody admits guilt on anything, and you get your numbers. What Clarence Thomas said is, if you are discriminating against people, you should be sued and you should be held accountable. And so his enforcement numbers were much better than under the previous chairman, Eleanor Holmes Norton. So did a great job there. And then he as we started off, he gets selected to be on the DC circuit in 1990.
And then he moves on rather quickly and goes through that confirmation process.
Yeah.
And the high-tech lynching, the term that he used, it seems to me, especially in the attacks that we've seen in recent weeks and in recent years, that high-tech lynching just continues. But let's talk about his time as Supreme Court Justice. And you're an attorney, so you'll be able to really do that in a way that makes sense to people.
Yeah, so I think Justice Thomas is our greatest Supreme Court Justice. And I don't have to think that the facts back it up. He's written more than 700 opinions. He's our greatest justice in terms of originalism, right? Originalism is a justice who says, I'm going to look at the clause of the Constitution, the provision, or you can talk about a statute, but I'm going to look at that provision and try and understand what the original meaning was of that provision at the time it was ratified. And I'm not going to try and put my own policy views into it. I'm not going to try and sort of try and update whatever the language is and say, oh, this is the right answer, because you're an unelected judge. That's not your job in our system, right? Your job is to apply that Constitution faithfully, those provisions of the Constitution. That's what Justice Thomas does, more faithfully than, in my view, any justice in the modern era. And I say that because Justice Scalia was an incredible justice, but in terms of what they call stare decisis, which is previous opinions and whether we need to let them stay in place, right? Even if we think they're wrong. And there's a school of thought that you really need to let that stuff stay in place. I think Justice Thomas, through his own life and challenging things, and as he says in the book, why are we supposed to stop thinking? Like, goodbye, I'll think on my own. And so you'll see that in lots of opinions where he goes back and says, what's the original meaning of that Constitution, of that clause? And maybe 100 years ago or 50 years ago, the court did something wrong. And then on top of that sort of false edifice, they've built a number of other opinions, and we're all supposed to follow that. And Justice Thomas, more than any other justice, I think, is willing to go back to the first principles and say, you know what, I don't agree with that. I'm overruling it. Now, a lot of times, so he goes on the court in 1991, right, and gets attacked. The left tries to belittle him, say he's a puppet of Scalia, can't think, just really, really racist things, right? There's cartoons of him as a member of the KKK. I mean, these are like the crazy things. You see this in this movie. And the amazing thing to me, Jenny Beth, is that Clarence Thomas, right, just gets to work. And he starts writing opinions, right? And he brings justices his way, literally from the first conference meeting he has as a Supreme Court justice. We know this because Justice Blackmun's papers, he kept notes. Justice Blackmun was not a very good justice in my view. But what he did do is he kept lots of notes. And when he died, after a certain number of years, he released them. And so you got to see what happened inside these meetings. And it shows that Justice Thomas, from his very first conference, was pulling justices his way, okay? That's the impact. Did you see that by the media? No, right? And so he goes about laying out, in my view, what his project, which is I'm going to go through as a justice, and I'm going to write opinions that lay down my vision. I don't care if I get 1 vote or 2 votes. I'm going to write, what I believe is the faithful interpretation of the Constitution. And so over 31 years now, he's our 12th longest serving justice in history, okay? And the longest is only, I think, 6 years. So he will likely be our longest serving justice in history. He has more than 700 opinions, and yes, he's been on the court the longest, but he has the most opinions per year average of any justice on the Supreme Court right now. right? He writes like 30 opinions a year, where some justices write 10 or 12. So it's an amazing, again, from the get-go, when he was writing solo dissents on different things, right? The Second Amendment cases, or the administrative state, and reining in agencies, right? To have Congress write the law that the agencies have to follow and not create law at those agencies. All of those opinions that used to be dissents or kind of solo concurrences are now commanding majorities. And you saw that with Dobbs, right? Justice Thomas voted to overrule Roe v. Wade in 1993 when he first got on the court. And then you see Bruin, which is the Second Amendment, religious liberties cases, as I mentioned, the administrative state cases. All of these cases are things that Clarence Thomas has laid out this jurisprudence that the other justices are following, right? That is why, we can get to this in a little bit, why the left has gone crazy to try and destroy him now. Because he used to be, they'd try to belittle him and he'd be laying down these opinions, and he wasn't kind of a threat to them, right, as a justice. Now he's in full. It is the Thomas court, right? He is the leading justice intellectually, but also, Jenny Beth, I think the thing that I'm so encouraged about, it's his personal courage as a justice, right? That is showing the other justices how to do this, right? One thing I think conservatives are always worried about is when you pick a justice, right, they're going to go left. Because
we worry about that a lot.
And there's been a lot of examples of it, right? Nobody goes to the right, but everyone goes to the left. And in fact, I was part of the teams that had interviewed the judicial candidates during the Trump years. And I found this chart, my wife had showed me the summer before, that showed that every justice had become more liberal. So during these interviews, I actually put this chart in front of the judicial candidates that we were interviewing.
Good.
And said, tell me why this isn't going to happen to you in 10 years. You may be fantastic right now. You may have the greatest opinions, but in 10 years, you know? And so I think that what Justice Thomas has shown, that you can be principled and come what may, right? As Justice Thomas says, sometimes it's pretty easy to get to the right answer. It's having the courage to actually follow through on that right answer. And so I think that's what he's showing. I think with the Dobbs leak, when that happened last year, which was clearly to intimidate the justices and try and get some of them to come off, I like to think that they saw the courage of Justice Thomas over the years, that they were not going to come off this opinion. They were not going to weaken it. And so as despicable and destructive as that act was, what I see, I'm always a silver lining kind of guy. I saw 5 justices standing strong in this storm who didn't falter, and I think that spells great things for this court going forward. And so, I run that back to both sort of jurisprudentially, Justice Thomas laying out a robust, jurisprudence on originalism, but also then that courage. That personal courage to stand up and do what's right.
And it took determination to see that confirmation process through, because other men, lesser men, would have just stepped down and not wanted to go through that fire. So I think that as painful and wrong as that was, it probably helped him understand you have to stand for what's true and what is right. And then being the sole dissenter on different cases, being the only one dissenting, it showed I'm going to stand for what's true and right. Even if I'm the only one doing it, I'm going to stand up for what is true and right. And eventually people do see the truth can't hide forever.
I truly believe that. It was early on in his term. It was on an Eighth Amendment case, and the New York Times called him the youngest, cruelest justice, right, for a solo dissent. And I've been friends with Clarence Thomas, since then, very close friends. And, it's never fun to be attacked like that, but he is never bent. He's never thought about, let me
trim my sails. Let me do what other people want, right? His entire life. What's so neat to see it, and I talk about the left, but also the right, and how he was doing things in the Reagan administration and getting pounded on sometimes from the other side. He was a guy who was going to do. Justice Thomas is the most engaging person, and when you talk to him, he's just he's going to do what he thinks is the right thing to do. On the confirmation, what's so beautiful about the movie Created Equal is Justice Thomas had recommended, to truly understand me, Michael Pack should interview Ginni Thomas. So out of this, in this filming, it's 25 hours with Clarence Thomas and 6 hours with Ginni. And what's so gripping, and I really encourage your audience to watch that movie too, is Ginni talking about how weak Clarence was when he went back up. When you see him fiery and talking about the high-tech lynching and how it had hurt him so much, but he went up there. He was never going to withdraw. He said, I don't run from bullies. I don't like bullies. I'm never leaving. But the strength, she said, I knew God was with him because I knew how weak my husband was at that point. And it's just this beautiful scene and that juxtaposition of seeing Clarence at the hearing table and then having Ginni talking about it, 30 years later, and how much strength it took, to do that, and how the left will destroy you. They don't care about you as a person. They don't care about your life. If you don't bend to them, they will destroy you. And particularly as a Black conservative, they will utterly destroy you. And you saw them doing that with Clarence Thomas. You're seeing them do it now. The part that really bugs me about that, and I've written a fair bit on it and before. I have a website, markpaoletta.com. I write a lot on Justice Thomas. I have lots of facts. I have lots of information on it. But, it's this whole idea of Clarence Thomas is this independent thinker, and the Black leadership wants to say, oh, he's a traitor. He's a terrible person who pursues policies that are harmful to the Black community. It's such a lie. If you look at issue after issue after issue, Black Americans agree with Clarence Thomas on almost every issue that you can think about. School choice, right? The NAACP is against school choice, right? 81% of Black parents want school choice, right? Affirmative action. There's a case coming up in the Supreme Court right now, right? Where the left is going berserk, right? Berserk. I think that's in part why all these attacks are coming, is on this case, okay? And it truly looks like, when you look at justices' past rulings and all that, they're going to probably strike it down, right? 62% of Black Americans are opposed to affirmative action in higher education, right? So it's just the craziest thing. But of course, the NAACP and the Black leadership are 1,000% for it. And so they perpetuate this lie, right? Because it's their funding and their agenda that they want to drive. So Clarence Thomas gets chewed up in it, and as he said, it allows other people then to attack you and say the most foul things about you. But he has his faith, he has his family, and he will never. It's not fun to go through, particularly when they were attacking his wife last year. On all these crazy smears. Yeah. But he's our greatest American, and he's had such an impact on the Supreme Court. Even the left today, Jenny Beth, say that Clarence Thomas is the most influential thinker and significant appointment in 40 years. And so the left is finally conceding. You saw this crazy, terrible documentary. I watch everything good and bad on Clarence Thomas. That was on PBS the other day. And they're calling it the Thomas Court. They're calling it Clarence Thomas is the leader of the court. These are people who said he wasn't qualified to be on the Supreme Court, a few decades ago, and now he's the leader. So it just shows you perseverance and principles is a winning formula.
That is very good. We still, you mentioned Ginni, and she's in the documentary. Talk about her a little bit, because she was standing right beside him and sitting in the hearing and has been with him throughout all of this time, and she's a lovely woman.
Ginny is a dear friend. I represented her in the January 6th investigation, and of course, as you recall, that there was crazy things about her in the news, the media. Just the Thomases trigger the left, and they lose their mind. As I always like to point out, she went in for an interview voluntarily, and guess what? The final, what was it, like an 853-page report, didn't mention Ginni Thomas once there, right? And so and
then they still had to release her video from her deposition or her interview, just to try to embarrass her. Just, they'll do anything they can.
They did, but I like to, it just the Thomases trigger the left. Ginny is a wonderful person. She's a longtime conservative activist, long before she met Justice Thomas. And here's the crazy thing, right? This shows the hypocrisy of the left. Ginni Thomas is a strong, independent woman who had her own career, right? And somehow to the left, that's anathema, right? When Justice Thomas is on the Supreme Court and she's supposed to stay in the kitchen or something like that. And you literally have these left-wing writers saying that, and it to me, it exposes, right, that their true views on things. Just like with Black Americans, if you don't have the right views, we're going to destroy you. You're not real. If you're a woman and you have conservative views, you're not real. We're going to destroy you. And so, and I've written a lot, Jenny Beth, on how, you'd have these similar circumstances of, there was one judge on the Ninth Circuit, wildly liberal judge. His wife was the head of the ACLU chapter in California, and she filed an amicus brief in the court below her husband, and that case went up to her husband, and he didn't recuse, and everyone defended him for not recusing. And they were like this wonderful couple, but when it becomes the Thomases, and Ginni Thomas has a thought that Obamacare should be should be repealed by the Congress, not by the courts. Somehow Clarence Thomas has to recuse himself because Ginni Thomas uttered some opinion about the Obamacare. It just shows you the hypocrisy and thuggishness and insincerity of the left. And so, the Thomases are wonderful people. They are each other's best friend too, and that drives the left crazy too, right? That they, and again, it goes back to, they like to paint this picture. It keeps, crumbling of Justice Thomas being dependent on white people. Originally, it was Larry Silberman. Then it was Antonin Scalia on the Supreme Court, and then his wife. You read these stories from last year. It's just despicable and disgusting, but it exposes the left for what they are.
And then when they make those kind of accusations about him, I think the underlying premise that they are saying is that they don't think that a Black man can be successful on his own in America.
On his own terms, absolutely.
Those comments actually are racist in their very core. It's not just insulting a man, but it is exposing what they think.
What's interesting is, again, this latest documentary, but I track this stuff. It's my passion, of what I'll call the evolution of the left, both from the Legal Academy, commentators, and then just your kind of what I'll call lefties, you know what I mean? But right. It is the Clarence Thomas court. Live with it. He is the most influential justice. He's, he's driving the court in his vision of what the Constitution is, and he has a number of justices who love him and who respect him. And I think the attacks on the court, right, even are galvanizing the court in a lot of ways they understand what's going on. These attacks you see, right, like the attacks on Justice Alito, the attacks on even Chief Justice Roberts attacking his wife, right, recently, right? Justice Barrett's husband and Justice Barrett. I mean, they don't stop, right? And they want to destroy the Supreme Court because it's no longer, as I call it, a super legislature that's going to, sort of implement these left-wing progressive things like abortion that have no place in the Constitution and they could never enact nationally. So they have looked for the courts for 70 years to help them implement their agenda, and now that's gone. And again,
it goes back to my view, 1991, and Clarence Thomas, and trying to keep him off the Supreme Court. He blew up the Senate Judiciary Committee, and that it was the most electrifying thing I've ever been a part of, to watch that. I mean, I was up there in the Senate building, and reporters and a lot of people thought that Clarence Thomas was actually going to withdraw that night.
I'm sure they were hoping for it.
They were hoping, and they were like, all this whispering, and Clarence Thomas goes in and just obliterates them, right? And it was such a satisfying moment, and then the next day, and remember, here's the thing, Jenny Beth, everyone, you were in college, right?
Yeah, I remember watching the hearings. I worked at Radio Shack, and we had the TVs on, and when it wasn't busy, it was just going and watching.
So it was one of those almost communal things, right? Because people didn't have their own personal devices, right? People huddled around TVs. Everyone watched those hearings of a certain age.
And everyone was talking about it everywhere.
Yes. So, and what I like to say is it was unfiltered. People got to watch, everyone testify, Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill, and all the other witnesses, right? And everyone came to their own conclusion, right? And guess what? 58% of the American people believed Clarence Thomas to what? 24% for Anita Hill. Only 26% of women believed Anita Hill. They watched her and they said, "You're lying," right? Or, "I don't believe you." And so what happens is, that's in 91. And then when you go on the Supreme Court, what's the left do? It's very, very difficult, even today, drawing back today, but for a justice to defend themselves,
yes,
right, in the court of public opinion. What are you going to do? You have 4 clerks and a secretary. That's all you have. People think they're these big, they are important people, but they don't have the infrastructure. They don't have a support system. That's why I'm a friend of Justice Thomas. I'm well enough along in my life. I've raised my kids where I can devote time to defending my good friend from these attacks. But the left continues to attack. And, and I think we could have done a better job over the years, like in the 90s and all, kind of pushing back on it, because again, people watched those hearings and realized Clarence Thomas was telling the truth and Anita Hill wasn't. And so what's encouraging today is that there is this full-throated defense of Justice Thomas, and in particular the Republican senators, and in the House, Jim Jordan and the Republicans did a couple hearings I testified at last year, where they invited me to testify. It was Democrats were running it, but to not allow these charges to go unanswered, to call them out for what they are, which is, this isn't about ethics. All of these attacks on Justice Thomas are just, they are what, sort of calling it out for what it is we want to destroy people. We want to have the American people not believe in that the Supreme Court has integrity, and to try and undermine, the Supreme Court rulings. And it's kind of dangerous, because they're basically saying, this court is corrupt, don't follow it. When there's nothing, there's zero corruption at the Supreme Court. There's zero unethical acts that are being done at the Supreme Court. And it's just a gaslighting by the left of the American people on the Supreme Court.
And it's wrong, and it undermines our institutions, and the ends justify the means, and in their minds. So they don't care if they harm one of the branches of government and completely undermine it, and undermine the faith of the American people in our way of government and in the greatness of America. None of that matters as long as they can continue to march towards socialism and communism.
Yeah. I always like to point out, I pointed out this when I testified, like the Supreme Court's approval rating right now is in the 40s, okay? But Congress is in like 20, right? 75% of the American people disapprove of Congress. So if there's any branch that needs to reform itself with accountability, it's the Congress. And they just seem so unself-aware of this point, and they want to attack the Supreme Court. It's kind of... And they keep having these hearings that turn out to be, in my view, disasters. They had a hearing yesterday, up in the Senate Judiciary Committee that turned out to be a disaster for them. They shut it down early. And then they had one, I think, a week or two before that, where the Republican senators were just on a complete rout of the hearing. And so that's the great thing that's in this day and age with the members of Congress who are
fighting mad about this and want to defend Justice Thomas and the other justices from these attacks.
Before we wrap everything up, go through. You brought the books with you, and you talked about the documentary. How did the documentary come to be, and what is so amazing about the access that the documentarians had?
So I mentioned, worked on his confirmation, gets confirmed. I go off, I'm working and I have 4 wonderful children where my wife and I are raising, but he keeps getting attacked. By 2016, there's another movie. There's so many anti-Clarence Thomas movies. This one's called Confirmation, starring Kerry Washington, which was on HBO. And I sort of like blew a gasket. I was so angry about it. And so I thought, you know what? Let's make a movie. I set up a website, justicethomas.com. It's got a lot of great stuff on it, his opinions and articles and videos and stuff like that, so people can learn about him. And so I talked to some friends, and we connected up with Michael Pack, who's a wonderful documentary filmmaker. All of his films have been shown on PBS, okay? And he was interested in making this film. And so it's called Created Equal. And Michael is just a genius. He really got Clarence Thomas. I spent a lot of time with Michael Pack. I'm the one who, talked to the justice about sitting down with Michael Pack. And it turned out to be, Jenny Beth, 25 hours of one-on-one interviews that Michael Pack did with Clarence Thomas over the course of several months. They're usually 4 hours sessions, okay? Everything on his life, from soup to nuts, right? Right to this is 2018. They were done. 2017 and 2018 were the interviews. So that's the origin of the film. No justice has ever sat down for 25 hours, and it was a really neat thing. It's like Clarence Thomas, like looking directly into the camera, and Michael Pack, interviewing him. And one thing that Justice Thomas had said was interview my wife, right? I would recommend. So we did 6 hours with Ginni. And so that movie is just this beautiful movie. I urge everyone to see it. It's such a wonderful movie on Clarence Thomas. And you can talk about all the lies. You can talk about all the things that the left is doing. The best way to counter that is to watch this movie and learn about the real Clarence Thomas and what an amazing life, what an amazing man he is, okay? Now, as we made that movie, okay, it's 25 hours. It's a 2-hour movie that's going to be on PBS. That means there's at least 23 hours that are not going to be shown, and more than that. So there's probably, 70 minutes of footage that's in the movie and some with Ginni, and it was just killing me as we made these cuts. There were certain things I thought when I was sitting there. I sat through the interview sessions, right, off to the side, and I'd hear Clarence Thomas say something. I'm like, wow, that's going to be a great thing in the movie. But it either took too long to say for a film, or it was just you need to cover all these different things because you're doing a movie on his life. So at a certain point, a light went off, like, we need to gather up this footage, all this interview stuff, and make it into a book. So that's what, when I left, I was in the White House at the time, and I knew I couldn't work on the book to that extent until I left. So when I left the White House in January 21, I signed a contract with Reagan in, I think, March or so, maybe a little bit later, April. And this is the book that came about, which is sort of the extended interview with Justice Thomas. So it's 95% of it is not in the movie. All the movie stuff is in there because that's like the best stuff, right? But there's other things about, books and commentary on sort of the current world, and a little bit more on his jurisprudence and his life, and it's just a beautiful book that's very conversational. He's sitting there talking to Michael Pack, who's asking him everything under the sun, and it's just I can sort of say how great it is because it's not my words, it's Clarence Thomas's words, right? And it's a beautiful way to learn about Justice Thomas in a very accessible way.
It is a very good book, and the documentary is very, very good. And then he has his own book. Yeah.
So this book right here is called My Grandfather's Son, and Justice Thomas, I think it was published in 2008. And he, like a classic Clarence Thomas project, he did it himself, right? He wrote, it was 3 times larger. He used to have a little USB thing around his neck, which was his manuscript that he'd work on. And he worked on it for years. And it's the most beautiful book. It was a #1 bestseller for, I think, 8 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, which is saying something, right? It's the New York Times. And when it was published, audio, like Audible and stuff like that, wasn't big. And so that wasn't resolved. So they actually didn't release one. He did it on CD. He recorded it in his own voice.
Oh, wow.
But then it took until a couple years ago when we went back to the publisher and they released it on Audible, on digital, in his own voice, and on Kindle. So for the first time in the past couple of years, it's available on Audible and Kindle. But it's a beautiful book. I have to say it's the most beautiful book in terms of his life. Our book is a little different. It covers the same ground in different ways, but brings it all the way up to 2018, where this stops in 1991. And so he doesn't talk about what being on the court or his colleagues and what he thinks of Justice Scalia and all that sort of stuff, which is in my book, Created Equal. I'd urge your audience to do all three of them. Watch the movie, and get both books.
I urge that as well. And he's known for not talking very much. So these are ways to get to see him and to hear him when you don't actually get to do that during what's happening on the court.
Yeah.
And generally speaking, the justices on the court, they're very well known people, but they're also, the public doesn't get to know them very well. So this is a good way to get to know them.
It's a great way to get to know Justice Thomas, and he has the most remarkable life of any justice on the Supreme Court, and any American really, and certainly in public office. So it's just, it's about an amazing life, showing this amazing country, and so they're well worth the time.
Excellent. So we will make sure that we include links to those in the description of this podcast and the video version of it as well. You mentioned your website, markpaoletta.com, and also justicethomas.com.
Yep.
And are there any, you're on Twitter.
I'm on Twitter at Mark Paoletta, which is MarkPaoletta. I tweet a lot with a lot of facts on all these crazy attacks on Justice Thomas. So it's well worth your time, I'd say, I put my articles up there, but I also just do some tweets that are very fact-filled about all the lies being told about Justice Thomas. And
it's important because there'll be a new hit piece out, and then you just come out and refute it. So it's a good place for the audience to go to find out the facts to counter the hit pieces. And I think they're going to continue.
They are going to continue, but as I said, the court has been galvanized. Justice Thomas isn't leaving anytime soon. When he went on the court, he was 43 years old, okay? And he's been on the court 31. He said, when he was confirmed, they took away my first 43 years. I'm serving at least 43 years. So we're at least 12 years out. And I think these attacks are going to have him serve even longer than 12 years. So he's a young man by Supreme Court standards. He's in good health, and he loves his job. He loves it. And so the attacks can continue. They're terrible, but Clarence Thomas is going to keep doing his job, as he says, and laying down a jurisprudence that's faithful to the U.S. Constitution.
And that is good for all Americans, even when you don't realize it and you're frustrated by the opinions. Making sure that we adhere to the Constitution is good for our country, and it's good for all Americans. And I am so thankful for Justice Thomas, and I'm thankful for you for just sharing so much about him and being such a strong advocate. And just being around you and having read a lot of what you've written about him, it's obvious that you're doing this from a place of friendship and love and respect and we all need someone like you advocating for us in our life. But hopefully we don't all need it. Hopefully we're not under the same kind of attack that he's under, but I'm so thankful that you're there doing that for him. So thank you very much. And thank you, Mark, for being here today and letting people get to know Clarence Thomas better, and now they all have hours more work to do to get to know him even better. But thank you very much for your time today.
Jenny Beth, thanks for having me on.
And this was Mark Paoletta, and he has a website, markpaoletta.com, and also justicethomas.com.
The Jenny Beth Show is hosted by Jenny Beth Martin, produced by Kevin Mooneyhan, and directed by Luke Livingston. The Jenny Beth Show is a production of Tea Party Patriots Action. For more information, visit teapartypatriots.org.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to stop freedom thieves from turning our country into a communist nightmare, be sure to click the thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And while you're at it, click the notifications bell to get an alert every time we post a new episode.